This is, a couple of months ago now. I don't know how long ago was it? About a month ago maybe. This is what my bike looked like after coming home from work one day. You can see in the forks there, you can see that bent, and the spoke, can't quite see it, but it's bent also. So I think something might have gone through my wheel as I was riding down the hill, and it caught in the spokes. Well, so much force that I was going fast enough, it bent the forks on my wheel, and look what it did to the guard, bent the guard, and I went flying over the handlebars and ended up on the road. So this was after I came out of hospital. I lost quite a bit of skin on my shoulder. It was quite a sore shoulder for a while, and skin on my hands and that, bung knee, still got a bung ankle. So it wasn't very fun. And here's I've got a picture there, but here's also my helmet. So thanks the Lord. If I wasn't wearing this helmet, I would be missing a substantial part of my head. So thanks the Lord that it was only a $9 helmet too, so He can protect us. That was bad enough, but the week before that, this is what my face looked like, because I was building an ice box in my boat, and I needed to glue the bits of foam around the sides and on the lid and on the bottom, and I was using a spray-on glue, ADOS. And while I was doing that, I decided to get my battery drill and drill in the next compartment. And of course, there was a bit of a fireball. The bat spark from the drill ignited all the fumes from the glue, and there was a bit of an explosion in my boat. And you can't really see, but I've got no eyelashes there. My hair's all singed, and my beard and my mow had a good trim. But the worst of it was my face was on fire for about 2 hours. So I had to, the Tamaki River, it's not the cleanest thing, but I had my face in the river for for quite a while. So I was thinking, man, I'm on a really bad run, I've had 2 weeks in a row and I'm just getting blown up and skinned. And I was thinking, when these things happen to you, obviously things go through your head. Why is this happening? Always. Or something happens to our family members, we say, why? It's just the human nature. We always question why bad things happen. Well, the Bible is very clear. It says in Proverbs 26, verse 2, as we had for our scripture reading, as the bird by wandering and as the swallow by flying, so the curse causeless shall not come. So in other words, the bird comes there, it doesn't just appear, right? The bird comes, in this case, by wandering, or the swallow doesn't just appear in your garage building those annoying nests. It flies there. So likewise, when we have a curse, when something bad happens, it doesn't come without a cause. There's always a cause behind the curse. So then we'll get 3 more questions out of that. Did I cause it? Is this my fault? Did Satan cause it? Or did God cause it? Yeah? And we're going to go through these 3 questions today, or 3 characteristics of a curse, why it comes. And there are opportunities where you can point to each one of these examples, and they do actually have a bit of truth behind them. Sometimes we cause it, sometimes Satan causes it, and sometimes indirectly God causes it. And so we're going to ask, how do I do this? How do I make suffering come to myself? How does Satan do it, and how does God indirectly cause evil by allowing these things to happen? So now we're going to watch something, and this is Stephen Fry. He's an atheist, a homosexual. He's very antagonistic against the gospel. So if you get offended, maybe you want to block your ears or something, because he's quite blasphemous. But we want to go through this because this is one of it's only a couple of minutes long, but it's one of the leading arguments that someone will put forth when they're arguing the non-existence of God due to the suffering in the world. They'll use the arguments that Stephen Fry says to say that God doesn't exist because these things happen. So just watch this, but just be forewarned that he's very bold with his mouth.
Suppose what Oscar believed in as he died, in spite of your protestations, suppose it's all true, and you walk up to the pearly gates and you are confronted by God. What will Stephen Fry say to him, her, or it?
I will basically, what's known as theodicy, I think I'll say bone cancer in children. What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world in which there is such misery that is not our fault? It's not right. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world which is so full of injustice and pain? That's what I'd say.
And you think you're going to get in on
No,
that?
but I wouldn't want to. I wouldn't want to get in on his terms. They're wrong. Now, if I died and it was Pluto, Hades, and if it was the 12 Greek gods, then I would have more truck with it, because the Greeks they didn't pretend not to be human in their appetites and in their capriciousness and in their unreasonableness. They didn't present themselves as being all-seeing, all-wise, all-kind, all-beneficent. Because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac, utter maniac, totally selfish, totally. We have to spend our life on our knees thanking him? What kind of God would do that? Yes, the world is very splendid, but it also has in it insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. They eat outwards from the eyes. Why? Why did you do that to us? You could easily have made a creation in which that didn't exist. It is simply not acceptable. So, atheism is not just about not believing there's a God, but on the assumption that there is one. What kind of God is he? It's perfectly apparent that he is monstrous, utterly monstrous, and deserves no respect whatsoever. The moment you banish him, your life becomes simpler, purer, cleaner, more worth living, in my opinion.
That sure is the longest answer to that question that I ever got in this entire series.
Okay, so there was a lot of blowback on that when he made that those comments, and I think even in Ireland they had anti-blasphemy laws, and so he was actually brought up before they'll talk about him going before the court because of his blasphemy in that clip. But anyway, 3 of his points that you'll hear very often. He said, when he's talking about bone cancer, he says, such misery is not our fault. Bone cancer in children, such misery is not our fault, is what he said. And then he also said there's insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. And he also said, a God who creates a world so full of injustice and pain. So we're going to look at these 3 points because they're very relevant to the whole discussion, and we'll answer them one by one. So first off, the suffering. When he said, we'll get to it. Yeah, he said, such misery is not our fault, when he was talking about bone cancer, right? Such misery is not our fault. Now, we read in the scripture reading that the curse causeless shall not come. And in Proverbs 3:33, the Bible says, the curse is in the house of the wicked, but he blesses the habitation of the just. Wicked meaning like a lawbreaker, right? Breaking God's law. The curse is in the house of the wicked. But you say, wait a minute, the child didn't necessarily break God's law. How can it be responsible for getting cancer? Well, that's it. We didn't say the child was responsible. Again, in Deuteronomy, behold, I set before you this day a blessing and a curse, a blessing which if you obey the commandments of the Lord your God, which I command you this day, and a curse if you will not obey. So there's a blessing for obedience and a curse for disobedience. Now, if you go to the cancer website, American Cancer Society website, you'll find on their page the exact cause of most childhood leukemias is not known. Now, I've taken leukemias here because that's the most common childhood cancer. He said bone cancer, but that's not very high up on the list. But the most common childhood cancer is leukemia. And the government says, after all the Association of Doctors and Oncologists and Specialists, they say the exact cause is not known. But they do say many childhood leukemias may be caused by a combination of genetic and environmental factors. So in other words, it's not the children's fault necessarily, but might have genetic factors, right? They might have inherited something from the parents that causes, the cells to mutate or the mechanism behind them getting cancer. Or there might be environmental factors. We don't know. There's so much, it's so complicated that we cannot, is it cell phones? Do they cause it? Does radiation from your computer screen, TV screen? We don't know. But we do know is that the curse causeless doesn't come, but the curse comes from transgression of God's law. Stephen Fry, when he says, it's not our fault, therefore it must be God's fault, right? He says, the bone cancer in children, it's not our fault. But this is the same argument that they'll say that creationists use. They say, we don't know how God created the universe. No, sorry, they say we don't see how it could be possible that evolution could create life that we have, or we don't see how it could be possible that something can come from nothing, therefore God must have done it. That's what they say we say. They say that's the God of the gaps. You have something that you don't know, so you just put God over it to fill it in. Well, that's exactly what he does. We don't know exactly what causes leukemia in children, and so he will say, well, God must do it, you know? God must create it somehow. So it's not a reasonable argument, but the argument that we do have is, if we diligently hearken to the voice of the Lord thy God, and will do that which is right in his sight, and will give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of these diseases upon thee. So we know two things now. One is, the curse causes shall not come. There's always a cause behind the curse. And number two, the diseases, we will not get disease if we obey the law of God. And that, again, we won't read it all, we'll just read a bit in bold. If you will not observe to do all the words of this law that are written in this book, then the Lord will make thy plagues wonderful. In the last verse there, also every sickness and every plague which is not written in the book of this law, then will the Lord bring upon thee. So we're saying, God is saying that every sickness and every plague he will put upon us if we do not observe to do everything that's in his law. So now we have that the curse shall come as a result of transgression. That's where we can arrive at. Obviously, we're not going to go through every case, because there are a whole lot of grey areas. But generally speaking, the curse comes because of transgression of God's law. And in fact, in Desire of Ages, page 471, all suffering results from the transgression of God's law. Somehow, we don't know if it's, for instance, I'm saying the transgression of the laws of nature. For instance, if you put a child with a cell phone, if cell phones do anything, I don't know if they do or not, but if you give a child a cell phone and it plays on it all day and it gets cancer, it's not the child's fault, but it is still breaking of God's laws. He says we have to be healthy, have to care for our bodies, have to stay away from that which is harmful to our bodies. And even though we don't know it, we're still breaking nature's law. So all suffering results from the transgression somewhere. So not necessarily the child's fault, not necessarily the parent's fault, but somewhere God's law is being broken. Now Stephen Fry, he's saying he despises this. For example, if we're talking about bone cancer, if there's a reason behind it, even though we might not know it, but there's a cause behind it, he's saying it shouldn't be. So what he's saying is really, he wants to be able to jump off a skyscraper and not get hurt. He wants to be able to slap someone in the face and them not be hurt. You know, he wants a world where we can operate without consequence to our actions. He doesn't believe that we should have disease as a result of mismanaging our health. Yeah, he wants us to be able to play on the sun, in other words, and not get burned. He wants a world without law or without consequence. That's what he's really saying. Now, just to put this in perspective, the whole leukemia debate, just when they bring it up, in the USA in 2018, the children under 14, there were 60 million of them, or over 60 million. Now the number that were to die of cancer, that's all cancers, not just leukemia, all cancers, is just over 1,000. So do a little bit of simple math, it works out to 0.0019%. So that's 19 children out of 1 million will get cancer. Well, that's still too much, you know, we don't want that. But all the children in New Zealand, we have 927,000 children in New Zealand, so out of the whole of New Zealand, 20 children will likely die from cancer. That's not good, but it's not a lot either. Now put that in comparison with abortion. They have almost 4 million births in USA and almost 900,000 abortions in 1 year. So you do the math again, and out of the almost 4 million births, 22% of them, 22% of, this is prospective births rather, not all live births or anything, it's prospective births, meaning they could be aborted or could be naturally birthed. Out of all the prospective births, 22% of them are aborted. That's 223 million per million, as opposed to 20 per million. So, and liberals like, well, I shouldn't say liberals, but people like Stephen Fry is a humanist, and so humanists are known for being pro-choice, as they call it, or advocating for abortion rights. He's saying misery is not our fault, it's God's fault. Bone cancer is God's fault. So in his terms, God is causing 20 deaths per million, but abortion is our choice. You know, it's man's willful decision to say, I don't want this child. And in most cases. And we have 22,000 children dying because of this. So the argument that he's using is quite, it's not very, it's way out, you know, it's way off. So he could have picked a better disease. But anyway, all suffering results from the transgression of God's law. But then you'll say to me, but what about Job? What laws did he transgress that brought about his suffering? And what about the blind man? You remember the blind man? We'll go through, I think he's here. Yeah. What about the blind man who, when the disciples asked, who sinned, this man or his parents, that he was born blind? And Jesus said, neither this man nor his parents sinned. So it wasn't a direct result of their sin that he was born blind. And he answered the reason that he was born, not the cause, but the reason that he was born blind was that the works of God should be made manifest in him. So in this case, the man's sin or his parents' sin wasn't the cause. So he said, well, what is? And Job as well. He was perfect and upright, meaning he was obedient to God's laws and his commands. And yet, see what happened to him. He lost a lot of family, lost a lot of belongings, and he eventually lost his health. Was all this a result of him transgressing God's law? So when we say suffering is a result of transgression, just keep in mind that's a general statement. In general, but there are special circumstances where God allows suffering, where it might not be the case that it resulted from transgression. So that's when we get into the second point. So the first point, did I cause the problem? Now with my icebox and the glue and the battery and the spark and the flames and the burnt face, that was me. I wasn't intelligent enough to realize that the fumes of the glue were extremely flammable, so much so that a drill can set them off. So that was my fault. However, riding down the hill on the bike and something goes through the spoke and I go over the handlebars, was that my fault? Well, I don't know what I could have done differently to avoid it, so unless I stop riding bikes, which I have now, by the way. But that wasn't my fault. So there are circumstances that result that aren't our direct cause of our own actions. And one of the causes of those, instead of us, is Satan. Now we read about Satan in John 10, verse 10. The thief cometh not but for to steal and to kill and to destroy. I am come that they might have, that's Jesus, I am come that they might have life and they might have it more abundantly. So Satan's purpose, his MO, his reason for living nowadays is to steal, to kill and destroy. That's what he wants to do. And he's doing it. Now Stephen Fry gives us the example of insects whose whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children and make them blind. This is what he said. Now before we get into how Satan Satan's influence is related to this, we'll just check out his statement first. He said the whole life cycle is to burrow into the eyes of children. Is this true? Well, we think he might have got it from David Attenborough. He said once, I think of when someone asked him, why don't you give more glory to God for his creation? You know David Attenborough? You know who that is? He does like the nature shows on British television. He says, I think of a little child in East Africa with a worm burrowing through his eyeball. The worm cannot live in any other way except by burrowing through eyeballs. So Stephen Fry said the whole life cycle is to burrow in the eyes of children, and David Attenborough said the worm can't live any other way. Now, are these things true? No. No insect on the earth depends on its burrowing into an eye. There are insects parasites that do burrow into the eyes, but their life doesn't depend on it. You know, what they're talking about in South Africa, a lot of these come from swamps, marshy grounds. You know, they live in an environment that's not necessarily an eye, but when they do it's rare, by the way, when they really do get into the eye, they can do it, but their life doesn't depend on it. And not only that, when he said the whole life cycle depends on it, it's not true. What he said, the whole life cycle is to burrow through the eyes of the children. No insect spends its entire life burrowing through an eye. That is from egg to larvae, pupae, worm, whatever. It doesn't spend the whole life cycle in the eye. So that part's not true. And it especially is not true that it has to be a child. The parasite doesn't say, oh, this is an adult, I'm going to pass on that and go to the child. It's not true. So everything that he said in this statement is, on the surface, false. Now we're just going to go back a little bit to Job. Let us pick up our Bibles and we'll read Job chapter 1, verses 12 to 19. And we'll see the causes of Job's suffering in this case. So, the blind man, Jesus said about the blind man, he didn't sin, his parents didn't sin, and this is that caused this blindness. And we're going to look at Job. What was the cause of Job's blindness? It wasn't necessarily his transgression. So I'll read from 12 verses through to 19. And the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your power. Only upon himself put not forth your hand. So Satan went forth from the presence of the Lord. And there was a day when his sons and his daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And there came a messenger to Job and said, the oxen were ploughing and the asses feeding beside them. And the Sabaeans fell upon them and took them away. Yea, they have slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I only am escaped alone to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the fire of God is fallen from heaven and has burned up the sheep and the servants and consumed them. And I only am escaped alone to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, the Chaldeans made out 3 bands and fell upon the camels and have carried them away, yea, and slain the servants with the edge of the sword. And I only am escaped alone to tell you. While he was yet speaking, there came also another and said, your sons and your daughters were eating and drinking wine in their eldest brother's house. And behold, there came a great wind from the wilderness and smote the 4 corners of the house, and it fell upon the young men, and they are dead, and I only am escaped alone to tell you. So what are the causes? We had the evil men coming and killing the servants. We had the fire from heaven burning up all the sheep, was it? And then we had the great wind destroying his sons and daughters. So what were the causes of Job's suffering? Yeah, but the direct cause. We had these things in nature, we had these evil men, but what caused them to do these things? What was the cause behind the evil men? Satan. Yeah, we read it in verse 12, wasn't it? And the Lord said to Satan, all that he has is in your power, only upon himself put not forth your hand. So God said, here is Job, you can do anything you want to him, but don't kill him. And Satan went out from the Lord and he did these terrible things. So Satan was the direct cause of Job's suffering, not Job's transgression. And we read that. So from these 2 stories, Job and the blind man, we see that they personally weren't responsible for their suffering, but Satan was. Well, I'll put there Satan for the blind man because that's my reasoning, that Satan caused this man to become blind from birth, and God allowed it for the glory of God. Because it wasn't a result of his transgression, wasn't a result of his parents' transgression. So that's just my thinking. But in Job, we know definitely that it was Satan that caused the suffering of Job's life. So when we're saying about these insects, going back to the worm in the eye, and we're saying, well, some insects do, some parasites do, in fact, infect children and people and animals, and they do eat the eye out or burrow through the eye. That's a terrible sounding thing, right? It's a horrible, and we have plenty of bad things here in New Zealand. I mean, we got like one poisonous spider and maybe a few offshore sharks. But, there are bad things in the earth, and we often question why. Why do lions eat the antelope, or was it the cheetahs eat the antelope? Why do we have predators and prey? Why do some beetles have mechanisms to create explosions in their body? Why does the female spider eat the male spider when they're done? Why all these questions, why do we have evil in the world? Look at this. Satan works through the elements also to garner his harvest of unprepared souls. He has studied the secrets of the laboratories of nature and uses all his power to control the elements as far as God allows. So Satan is working in nature. Now there might be other reasons why, for instance, we have carnivorous animals. There might be other reasons and why we have poisonous toadstools, for instance. But ultimately, in my understanding, Satan causes a lot of it. Satan causes a lot of the evil that we see in the animal kingdom. Look at this, in the Bible Commentary 1086. Not one noxious plant was placed in the Lord's great garden, but after Adam and Eve sinned, poisonous herbs sprang up. In the parable of the sower, the question was asked the master, Didst not thou sow good seed in thy field? How then hath it tares? The master answered, An enemy has done this. All tares are sown by the evil one. Every noxious herb is of his sowing, and by his ingenious methods of amalgamation he has corrupted the earth with tares. So all this poisonous things in the plant kingdom, that's all are the result of Satan's studying the secrets of the laboratories of nature. It's all Satan's influence. So who created evil in nature? Satan. Well, in my understanding, Satan created these bugs that burrow through the eye. He created the poisonous plants that kill people. You know, the white lilies that a child eats, so they'll die. It's not God creating that, it's Satan. But isn't God responsible then for allowing it? This is the next question, very important one. So we create problems in our lives by transgressing the laws of health and of the moral laws. Also, sin brings upon us suffering. But sometimes it's not us, sometimes it's Satan that causes it. But what about the ultimate? What about God? Is God allowing evil to exist because he's an evil-minded, capricious God, as Stephen Fry put it? So in Deuteronomy 30 verse 19, God said, I call heaven and earth to record this day against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that both thou and thy seed may live. So God here gave the Israelites a choice. He said, you can obey and be blessed, or you can disobey and be cursed. Now some might say, oh, that's not a very fair choice. Well, it's a choice nonetheless. God gave choice to man to eat from the tree. You know, when God spoke to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, he said, if you eat of this tree, if you touch this tree, did he say touch it? I cannot remember. If you eat of this tree, in that day that you eat thereof, you shall surely die. He said there's going to be consequences to your eating that tree, the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now they still had a choice. They didn't have to go and take from the tree and eat, but they did. They chose. So a fundamental part of when people say God allowed it, it's also God allows us choice. And we have the key word free will. You'll hear that a lot when going through these arguments. Now, Stephen Fry said, a God who creates a world so full of injustice and pain. When he's talking about why God's so evil, he said, God creates a world so full of injustice and pain. Is this true? Did God create all this evil in the earth? Of course not. He created it perfect. So who did? Why do we have this world as it is? Satan, for the most part. But why does God allow Satan to do that? Now, isn't it become God's responsibility if it's in his hand to stop evil and he doesn't? Isn't that make him guilty? Remember the free will. God gives us a choice. God's not forced. He cannot force us. Now look at this. This is in the chapter The Origin of Evil. A very good chapter on this subject. Infinite wisdom. Great controversy. Sorry. Infinite wisdom did not destroy Satan. Since the service of love can alone be acceptable to God, the allegiance of his creatures must rest upon a conviction of his justice and benevolence. The inhabitants of heaven and of other worlds, being unprepared to comprehend the nature or consequences of sin, could not then have seen the justice and mercy of God in the destruction of Satan. Had he been immediately blotted out from existence, they would have served God from fear rather than love. The influence of the deceiver would not have been fully destroyed, nor would the spirit of rebellion have been utterly eradicated. So I know it's a long passage, but basically what's going on here is saying God didn't destroy Satan because all of the heaven's inhabitants wouldn't have understood sin. They wouldn't have understood the consequences to rebellion and to disobedience. So if God had have destroyed Satan right when he had those first sinful thoughts, if God had destroyed him, and angels would be going, what's going on? Why did God destroy him? Maybe what he said was true about God. He's a forceful God that doesn't allow anybody free will to choose, or he'll just destroy him. Well, God acted in a way that the results of sin and the consequences of our choices will be made manifest. In a way, when people bring up this idea that God is responsible, we can ask, well, why do we have punishments for evil in our land? When we say there's consequences to transgression of God's law, that's evil, but then we say, but it's fine to give someone the death penalty in America, a death penalty for murder. Yeah, it's all right for the state to do it, but it's not good for God to do it. And just on that point as well, if we think of the result of sin being ultimately death, if God had just wiped out Satan, what would have happened to sin? Would sin still come again? Would it be possible for someone else to do what Satan did? We think of our governments when whatever state allows it, when they give the death penalty, does that stop murderers? No. It is a deterrent, sure, but it doesn't stop them. Somewhere along the line, someone will rise up again and commit murder. So God had to find a way that not only would sin be blotted out from existence, but that everyone would understand and choose to follow God and choose to obey instead of this other choice of disobeying. So why does God allow evil men to hurt innocent people then? Let's just think about this in our minds for a second. What would the world look like if God had destroyed all those who sin against their fellow men? Say there's a man out there and he wants to steal a car. What would happen if God just destroyed him? What would the world look like if God destroyed everybody who even thinks about stealing a car? Or another sin. Yeah, right. The world would be empty, right? There'd be no one. So where do you draw the line then? Where do we say that God should stop somebody murdering someone, but he should allow someone stealing the car? Does that work? And so God said, I'm going to allow, he also said, I will protect you. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear God and serve and delivereth them. So God will say he will protect us, but there are instances when he lets things happen, not because it's in the best interest of the universe to stop it, but it's in the best interest of the universe to allow it. So Stephen, we already said this, he wants a world where there's no consequences to violation of law. Yeah, he hates the idea that disease is a result of our own negligence. He hates an idea that the pollution in our cities are causing asthma and respiratory problems, or the water is causing problems, or there's any amount of things that we as a society are doing that are causing all these problems. But he doesn't want to acknowledge that. He wants to point the finger at God. He also wants a world where Satan doesn't exist. Well, I think that's a good aspiration and it's good hope, but it's not true. Satan does exist, and we have to deal with this world as it is. And he also wants a world where free will doesn't exist. He wants God to wipe out everybody, in other words. Everybody who has a sinful thought, he wants God to wipe out. So what's God's answer then? With all this suffering and all these problems and all this evil in the world, what is his answer to it? So obviously we know it's not to destroy us, otherwise we wouldn't be here today. For in Hebrews chapter 2 verse 14, the Bible says, "For as much then as children are partakers of flesh and blood, he also himself likewise took part of the same, that through death he might destroy him that had the power of the death, that is the devil." The only way that God could come up with a plan, to execute a plan where sin would never ever come again, and to atone for all the hatred and evil that is in the world, was to give his own son as a sacrifice. It was the only way that the lawgiver suffered the death of the lawbreaker in his place. It's the only way that we could be saved, and that also the universe would be protected ever again from hurt. Can you imagine? There's there's plenty of things out there that they secular world, they talk about what heaven will be like, but they don't seem to grasp the idea of that. What would happen if we went as we are to heaven? What would heaven look like? It would be a terrible place. It would be just like earth, no different. And so they're complaining about all these things on earth, and yet they don't understand that God is doing this to stop it. He's allowing evil to happen in order that heaven will be completely pure for all eternity. And the fundamental way he did that is through Jesus sending his own son to suffer in our place. In Nahum 1 verse 9 he said, "He will make an utter end, affliction shall not rise up a second time." There's only one earth, and there's only one period of this earth's history that has sin in it. When we're done here, and the sin is solved, sin problem is finished, and the atonement is made, there will never again be a planet Earth or any planet in sin and suffering and evil and pain and heartache. Never again. So that's our goal, is the end goal, our goal is sinlessness, is to be in a place where we're not going to have this suffering, not going to have this hurt, not going to have these problems, but we also have to realize that the problem in this world is sin and it's Satan. And there is a way through, and we're looking forward to that blessed hope. So may God bless us, and may we have an answer ready to give to those who come to us and say, why is there so much suffering in the world? We now have 3 answers: ourselves, Satan, and for the eradication of sin, the ultimate eradication of sin, being free will as its central concept. So thank you all, and may God bless us. Amen.